Good morning, everybody. SF Live, episode 55. I'll be joined by Dan Earle, President and CEO of Solaris Resources, in 1 minute. I hope everybody had a good weekend. This is episode 55. Please use hashtag AskSLS for your questions. That's going to be the company's ticker once they go public or go live on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And as always, make sure to follow us on YouTube, on Twitter, on Spotify and Instagram to get the latest updates. Now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Daniel Earle. He is the President and CEO of Solaris Resources. Dan, how are you doing? I hope you had a good weekend.
Very well. Yes, thank you. I did. I hope you as well had a good weekend.
Yeah, can't complain. It's great to have you on the show. We had to move the date a couple times because we were planning to go live on the first day of trading. And of course, dealing with the exchange, with Corona and everything, a couple things have been delayed. But we stuck to the 8 o'clock today. 8 a.m. PST, and I'm glad you're joining us. So give us an update. Yep. Solaris is a deal that's not listed yet. You're expecting the listing any day. So give us a brief rundown of Solaris Resources, please.
Yeah, sure. It's my pleasure to do so. Solaris Resources, it's a copper gold growth and discovery story. It's managed by the Augusta Group, which has an unrivaled track record of value creation, totaling over $4.5 billion of exit transactions in the last decade. And it's backed by Ross Beatty and Lucas Lundin, who are some of the most successful players in the mining industry. So we've got a portfolio of copper and gold assets. These are all in the Americas. Our flagship project is called Warintza in Ecuador. It features a high-grade resource, which has obvious expansion potential, but boasts additional discovery potential beyond that. And then we've got a portfolio of grassroots projects, Tamarugo and Chinal in Chile, and we're adding other properties in Chile, Capricho and Paco Orco in Peru. And then we've got a pair of JVs with major mining companies. So Freeport-McMoRan on our Ricardo exploration project in Chile, and then Teck Resources on a development stage project called La Verde in Mexico. So the way to think about all this is basically David Lowell's portfolio of projects. Our flagship project, Warintza in Ecuador, that was his discovery from the early 2000s. And then our exploration projects are his targets for future discovery.
Okay, let's touch on that for a second, because David Lowell is a character. Unfortunately, late David Lowell, he passed away recently, but he left quite a bit of legacy and big shoes to fill as well for you, Dan. But in terms of exploration success, he's appointed, or he's worked with somebody on your team. Your VP exploration, I think, was his protege, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
So run us through the legacy he left behind and what he left Solaris behind, maybe.
Yeah, well, I'm never going to fill, you made this statement that I've got big shoes to fill. I'm never going to fill David's shoes. He's an absolute legend. We refer to him as the world's greatest explorer. I'd say that that's basically an unarguable point. He's made more discoveries of greater consequence than anyone in history. I suppose if I were to sort of sum up his career, I'd take you back to the beginning where he defined with John Gilbert, this would be in the early 60s, the porphyry copper deposit model for the first time. So this is obviously the deposit class that accounts for the majority of the world's copper production, something like 60% of the world's copper. And then he took that model and then applied it in the most direct way possible in the field to make a whole series of discoveries. So starting with discoveries in Arizona like Kalamazoo and Veckle Hills, but then a series of discoveries through the Americas and the high deserts of Chile and Peru. But the key to David's success, aside from just the basic brilliance and work ethic and drive that, kind of was your starting point, was the innovation along the way. So, of course, after you define the deposit model and go out and make a series of discoveries, the industry catches on, and then you have to innovate to continue to make discoveries. And that's what he did. So the middle part of his career was actually probably the most prolific, where he started looking for obscure deposits. And so this featured discoveries like La Escondida, which is the largest copper mine in the world now and one of the biggest metal mines, period. This deposit passed through the hands of 5 companies before he made that discovery. And that was based on him recognizing the weathering products of some of the alteration products from these porphyry systems in the extremely arid environment where that project is located. And then likewise, if you think about his discovery of Parina, which he's famous for with gold investors, Arequipa, he was the first one to identify the North Peru gold belt after extensive library study, mapping, reconnaissance, and sampling in an area that really wasn't thought to be prospective for gold. And that's what allowed him to make the Pierina discovery in '96, which was acquired by Barrick for over $1 billion that year. And it went on and on. I'd suppose the kind of the final leg of his career would be in blind discoveries. This is what David thought would be the future of industry. And, so you could categorize projects like Warintza, and then our exploration projects like Tamarugo and Chinal, Ricardo. These are all targets for blind discoveries that David really envisioned would be the future of industry.
Now, we got to come back to Warintza and talk more about the exploration and what you're planning to do as next steps. You raised a ton of money recently, but let's talk about more of the setup of Solaris Resources first. Let's start properly. Like, what's the history of the company? I understand it's a spin out from Equinox, so give us some details on the transaction. Correct. There.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was spun out of Equinox in 2018, and so shareholders of Equinox at the time would have received 1/10 of a share of Solaris. So those shares now account for about 25% of our share structure. And then the balance of the shares have been issued through a series of placements. So those placements were at about 10 million shares at 50 cents. And then the balance of the shares at, and that was a share deal. And then the balance of the shares through unit placements at 80 cents, including the financing that you alluded to, the financing that we just completed recently. So overall, we've got about 88 million shares outstanding. As I said, about 25%, 22 million shares of those spin-out shares, and then the balance have come about through these placements.
Yeah. What's really important for me to point out, because that's cap structure, especially what we've seen lately in the markets, is a big topic, because you can screw up a deal from the get-go, and also management incentives. Like, one thing I want to highlight is you bought your shares at 80 cents mostly. Is that correct?
Yeah, my cost structure is, the majority of the funds that I put into the company have been at 80 cents. So that's basically where my cost structure is. The same is true of our executive chairman, Richard Wark. His cost is about 80 cents. And then Lucas Lundin and Ross Beatty, they've participated in all the placements along the way, but they also would have had shares in the spin-out, as would Richard. But that's a small fraction of their overall share position. So I think everyone's cost base for this company is going to be in that 50 to 80 cent range. Probably Ross Beatty and Lucas a little bit lower in that range, and then Richard Wark and myself, give or take 80 cents. And that's where we expect the company to begin trading.
Okay, good point as well. But Lucas Lundin and Ross Beatty do get the credit for starting everything and putting it together, so they get the risk upside there as well, I guess. One thing we quickly need to talk about, like, you got 25 million shares that have been dividended out to Equinox shareholders. What do you anticipate sort of happening in terms of the first few trading days? Do you see it, or do you expect a lot of liquidity as shares coming out, or like, what's your feel for that?
Yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. It's 22 million shares. There's a large number of shareholders, so thousands of shareholders, and they individually have very small positions. So I think some of those shareholders will find that they have a share of Solaris and not know what it is and decide to sell. So that's probably the bulk of the liquidity that you'll see when the company, in the first few weeks of the company trading. But then other of those shareholders are interested in adding to their positions, and we've got a lot of inbound requests on whether individual shareholders could participate in placements or otherwise buy shares. So you'll see some of those shareholders buying as well, and some will probably just hold in the middle. And then on the other hand, you have a lot of people who weren't able to participate in placements, or who were able, but not to the degree that they would have liked to, who are going to be adding shares as well. So there's going to be a whole kind of mixture of flows over the first few weeks of the company's trading, and what that amounts to in terms of share price, I don't know. but I'm hopeful that everyone has an opportunity to buy shares at my cost. Or thereabouts.
Well, if you have 88 million shares outstanding, you plan to trade, or first trade at 80 cents, the market cap actually leaves some room for growth as well, right? So quite positive. It's not priced at a premium just yet, okay? So
no, I don't think it's a pretty premium. Like I would argue, we've got a little over $25 million in cash. So if you back that out of that, that market cap number, it doesn't leave a tremendous enterprise value beyond what you would expect sort of a shell to trade at with these players involved. Richard Wark at the top, and then Ross Beatty and Lucas Lundin.
Okay.
So I think it represents a reasonable value. And then, of course, ultimately, the market and the results are going to determine what the end product is.
We're going to get to the Augusta Group and Richard Wark in just a second. I just want to stay on the cap structure for one moment, because also investors can already actually participate or own Solaris by buying Equinox warrants. So can you run us through that process? Like, how does that work? What's the conversion look like, and what's the rough conversion price right now?
Yeah, so you're speaking about the listed warrants. So there's October 2021 warrants, which are exercisable at $15 per Equinox share, that are listed and trade on the TSX. And so I'm not sure where those are trading right now, but if you were to exercise one, obviously you get one share of Equinox, and then you also get a tenth of a share of Solaris. So I think at the moment they probably trade purely off of the Equinox value. And so you'd essentially be getting a tenth of a share of Solaris for free.
Okay, so that's quite interesting, because you could actually own Solaris before you were even trading. So that's an interesting vehicle to play this.
Yeah, I think it'd be tough to build up a decent sized position in Solaris through buying those warrants, though, because you're getting a tenth of a share. So
actually, I have to run through the numbers to see what the cost would be for Solaris share. Actually, if you could get a discount before the first trade, right?
Yeah. Well, I think everyone has different approaches to that, but I probably shouldn't comment.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Okay, let's continue, because next step from cap structure, you raised $25 million recently, right? 25, I think it was $25 million. Just before
we raised a little over $20 million. So I think it was 21 and change. 25 million units were issued at 80 cents.
Exactly. So, and let's talk about the expiration of the program. Let's talk about Warintza. Let's talk about the projects. Let's dive a little deeper there. Or actually, you know what? Stop. Let's stop right there. Let's talk about Augusta Group real quick and Richard Wark and their involvement before we talk about expiration and the projects, because we're going to spend a little more time on them.
Yeah, sure.
So, Richard Wark is the executive chairman. Like, how is he involved in the day-to-day, and what kind of benefits are you drawing personally from the Augusta Group?
So he's executive chairman, as his title implies. He's not involved in the day-to-day running of the company in terms of like designing exploration programs and managing contracts and personnel and so on. But he does certainly contribute in terms of making high-level decisions. And then when he needs to get more involved down to the granular detail, he certainly does that. There's no shortage of work ethic from Richard Wark. This is a gentleman who is successful because he works hard. He truly is at 24/7. It wouldn't be uncommon to get a phone call from him early on a Sunday about something to do with the company, and then go to work on it, for example. So he manages at a high level, gets more involved when he needs to. Working with him is a pleasure. He's obviously got a wealth of experience. He's unbelievably successful. He's laser focused on what's important and what drives value. And you can't help but learn by having exposure to someone like that.
What's his background? Is he an engineer, a geologist?
I think he's got a general business background. Yeah. He's not a technical guy. Okay. Although, of course, Friedland wasn't a technical guy either. But it's hard to tell now. These people they're bright people, and they learn on the way, of course, because they're incredibly focused on their industries.
Yeah. Good point, actually. Let's talk about people, and that should be our segue into the exploration side. Let's talk about Federico Velasquez, and maybe highlight him as well. And then we can segue into exploration programs and planning and budgets and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Federico Velasquez, he's our VP operations. He's the real star of the show in terms of restarting, repairing, and then restarting kind of the relationship and what's now a strategic alliance with the indigenous community partners that we have on our Warintza project in Ecuador. He's got a background with major international resource companies, primarily with Anglo American, but then prior to that with oil and gas companies. But he's also got experience working in government on First Nation files for the BC government.
Can I stop you for a second? I made a mistake. I meant Jorge Fierro. We did talk.
Oh,
Of course, it's super important. Like VP operations on the ground locally is insanely important.
yeah.
But I made a blunder. I made
Okay.
Jorge Fierro
No,
because I was
he is the
alluding
star of the
to
show, and that's
Dave
why,
Lowell's
and
protege.
he doesn't get enough credit. That's why in every presentation I always highlight Federico Velasquez.
That's
as the
why,
star
like,
of
because
the
you've been
show.
like we had a call
Yeah,
on
no, the
Monday
investor
to run me
focus
through the
very much on
story.
your personality.
That's what came up. She's like, but I wanted to talk about Dave Lowell's protege because for me, like, I wanted to make that segue into the exploration side. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So Jorge Fierro, he's our VP Exploration. We refer to him as David Lowell's protege. Worked with David Lowell for a little over, the last decade, and of course learned a lot to him. Looked up to David as a mentor, as anyone would. And prior to that, experience with major international companies, BHP, and so on.
no, fantastic. Let's talk about the exploration. What is Jorge planning for us moving forward? Let's talk about Warintza and the plans there.
Yeah, so we're just in the process. So our province, Morona Santiago in Ecuador, allowed for the resumption of activities at the beginning of June. So we restarted activities then in terms of getting our site prepared again, getting supplies shipped in, and so on. We'll start drilling in the next month or so. And initially with one rig, we've got to prove the efficacy of our COVID protocols. And then once those are proven to be successful, as we anticipate them to be, then we'll start ramping up the level of activity. So our budget as it stands today calls for 3 rigs. Certainly, I think we'd like to get a lot more aggressive, but results will dictate how we go.
Okay. What's the business plan moving forward for Warintza? Like, what's the goal? What do you plan to achieve there on the first phase program there?
Well, as I said in the intro, Solaris is a growth and discovery story. So in terms of Warintza, we're starting at Warintza Central with a very high-grade resource, which is essentially sitting at surface, actually outcropping. It's open in every direction laterally, and then the holes were drilled to a very shallow depth. This is drilling that dates back to the early 2000s with a true backpack portable rig. So the average drilling depth is less than 200 meters. And those holes are bottoming in mineralization. With the types of grades that we have, we could easily drill us down to 1,000 meters. So both laterally and at depth, our intention is to take that starting resource that we have, 124 million tons, would work out to, at a reasonable size operation, kind of a 5-year life, and then to grow that significantly. That's kind of the first priority. The second priority, and the real key to understanding the opportunity of Warintza and what we're all excited about, is the discovery potential that exists beyond that. So Warintza Central, the resource that I referred to, is at the very center of a 5-kilometer long trend of outcropping high-grade copper mineralization. You can literally stand on top of over 1% copper kilometers outside of that resource limit in multiple directions. So it's really about the discovery potential beyond that, on as well as the growth on the copper side. There is a gold aspect to the story that emerged relatively more recently. So this is based on data that came in the second half of last year. We've got some very large gold anomalies that we're going to be following up on. The largest of those is an anomaly that we refer to as Kaya. This is sitting out to the east of the Warintza system. It's down in the valley underneath cover, so it was never a priority for David Lowell. David Lowell was always about the easiest route to making a discovery. For him, that low-hanging fruit was the outcropping high-grade copper that was sitting up on the ridgeline, basically Warintza Central. The gold, on the other hand, is down on the valley underneath cover. We did a significant amount of sampling over that southern anomaly late last year. The results came in. We've got a target there which is 4.5 kilometers long by 4 kilometers north-south. If you're thinking in terms of the footprint, that's world-class. Detour Lake, for reference, would be about 3 kilometers, 3.5 kilometers by 1.5 kilometers. So major footprint. There's no outcropping mineralization, but we have pitted down and exposed some coarse pyrite stockwork. And the next step for us, probably geophysics, but then drilling to see if we can actually turn that anomaly into a world-class discovery.
And let's call it the semi-discovery, because you're not just there yet, but you found something. But that made you change also the company name from Solaris Copper to Solaris Resources to sort of reflect, let's call it the polymetallic values of the projects. Is that
Absolutely.
right? Where you're planning to drill roughly 35,000 to 40,000 meters. How are you going to split up the meters between the projects, between Warintza Central and Kaya?
So yeah, we just start with the simplest possible plan, which is to drill off Warintza Central. So 3 rigs, average of 40, 50 meters a day over the course of the year, with a ramp up schedule is 40,000 meters of drilling. And that's enough to drill off Warintza Central. As I said, the expectation is that we're going to have an opportunity to get more aggressive. And certainly the mindset of the Augusta Group in general is to do precisely that. If you go back to Arizona Minerals, the last great success story within this group, before they sold that company to South 32 for over $2 billion, they had 18 drill rigs operating. So we're a long way from that. We're starting off with 1 rig, and then we intend to go to 3. But certainly, I think there is scope and a desire within this group to go to more drill rigs.
Okay, fantastic. We got one question that was sent to me via direct message here on Twitter, and it is regarding the work environment at Warintza, because you're working besides a Chinese state-run company. Is it contentious, or do you have an ability to work together?
We don't have any relations with the with the Chinese company that's next to us, EXA, which is a JV between 2 Chinese companies, and they're in fact not active on their project. So this is the project that you're speaking about is called San Carlos Panatza. It's a little over 1 billion tons of 0.6 copper in open pits, and this is sitting. It's undeveloped, of course. This would be engineering stage, and it's sitting about 7 kilometers out to the west. And they're not active on the moment on that project at the moment. It was always envisioned as being sort of a phase 2 to their phase 1 starting project, which is Mirador. Mirador is located about 45 kilometers down the highway to the south of us. It's, again, a little over 1 billion tons of resources, 0.65 copper equivalent. So world-class in terms of scale, world-class in terms of grade. That was built by EXA and went into production late last year for a little, it was about $1.4 billion US, and came online roughly at a similar time as Fruta del Norte. It's now the biggest mine in Ecuador.
Okay, fantastic. It's because it's state-run. People barely know about Mirador, really. Like, unless you're really entrenched into Ecuador.
It's outside the it's really outside of the scope of the investment universe, but it's this was a David Lowell project. It's something that we're very focused on, of course, because it provides a template for kind of what the opportunity is at Warintza.
Fantastic. Dan, we're sort of coming up to our time limit. We already talked for 22 minutes. Time always flies.
Wow. Okay.
Right?
That went fast.
We definitely have to schedule an update because I want to talk about the other projects as well, but we'll leave that maybe for after you start trading. So run us for the expected news flow once you go public. What can investors expect will be hitting the wires?
It is going to be relatively quiet for probably, it could be, until sort of late summer before we actually come out with drill results. Now, of course, it was all coordinated based on our originally anticipated listing timeline, which was to get the company listed by the end of the first quarter. But of course, the COVID pandemic and the market turmoil scuppered all of that. And then, now we've got this, this lag between when our listing is accomplished, which we expect in the next few days, and when we'll actually have drill results to report to the market, which, as I said, it could be late summer before those results actually hit the tape.
Yeah.
So it is going to be relatively quiet. I think that's fine given the share structure that we're working with, given the kind of the competing flows between people who perhaps want to sell and then people who want to add to their positions. We're effectively going to have sort of a settling out period, and that's just fine for us.
Yeah, fantastic. The listing ticker will be SLS. One thing I haven't asked is it Toronto, big board, or venture?
It's on the venture. I think we actually probably would have qualified for the main board given the cash position that we have today, but it'll be listed on the venture.
Yeah, it's something I hadn't asked personally before. That's why. So it's SLS will be the ticker moving forward. Listing any day, hopefully now. And then Dan, really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for sticking to the timeline today. And
that went really quick.
Oh, the 24 minutes. It's insane. But good conversations always go by quickly, right?
Yeah.
So again, really.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to that next update.
Yeah, appreciate giving us the scoop, and everybody else. Thanks for tuning in. We'll have many more questions and sessions with Dan in the future. I'm sure we'll hear a lot about Solaris Solaris. Go to solarisresources.com is the website. Follow them on Twitter. Follow Dan. He's a great follow on Twitter, knowledgeable and great read all the time. So somebody I have popping up as push notifications, actually. Follow us, of course, as well. Don't forget that. Follow us on Twitter and YouTube, and make sure you subscribe and hit the alert button. So Dan, thanks for coming on, and we'll catch up very, very soon.
Thanks again.
Take care.